In 1945, Robert Oppenheimer watched the first nuclear detonation and reached for ancient scripture. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. For 80 years, we've treated this as poetry, a scientist grasping for language grand enough to match what he'd built. But what if Oppenheimer wasn't reaching for metaphor? What if he was reaching for the closest reference he had to what he'd just witnessed? 4,000 years before the Trinity test, scribes in Mesopotamia recorded weapons that turned cities to glass, poisoned the land for generations, and carried death on the wind. They gave these weapons names. They wrote treaties banning their use. And they described in detail a debate among gods about whether such weapons should ever exist. The Sumerians didn't imagine nuclear war. They remembered it. The New Mexico desert lies silent in the pre-dawn darkness of July 16, 1945. And somewhere in a bunker, a man named Robert Oppenheimer waits with dozens of other scientists for a countdown to reach zero. And in this moment, before the flash, everything is still theoretical. Everything is calculation and prediction and educated guessing, because no one has ever seen what they are about to see. No human eye has ever witnessed the release of atomic energy on this scale, and the men in that bunker have spent years working toward this moment. Years of equations and experiments and failures and breakthroughs. Years of recruiting the finest minds in physics and chemistry and engineering. Years of building an entire secret city in the New Mexico wilderness where thousands of people lived and worked without telling their families what they were doing. And all of it has led to this countdown, to these final seconds before the theoretical becomes actual, before the mathematics transforms into light and heat and shockwave. And then the countdown ends and the device detonates. And for a fraction of a second, a new sun appears on the surface of the Earth, brighter than anything any of them have ever experienced. A light so intense that it seems to burn through closed eyelids and turned backs, and every barrier the observers had placed between themselves and ground zero. And the men who witnessed it would later struggle to find words adequate to what they saw. They would speak of colors that had no names, of a brilliance that seemed to come from everywhere at once, of a moment when the boundary between day and night simply ceased to exist. And in the aftermath of that flash, in the silence that follows the shockwave, Oppenheimer speaks. And the words he chooses are not scientific, not technical, not the measured language of physics that has governed his professional life. Instead, he reaches for something far older, words written in Sanskrit thousands of years before the first laboratory was built, words from a text called the Bhagavad Gita, that he has read so many times he knows it by heart. And he says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." And the conventional interpretation of this moment is straightforward enough. A literary man reaching for poetry adequate to the horror he has just witnessed. A scientist so steeped in ancient texts that they surface naturally in moments of crisis. A man who loved the Bhagavad Gita, simply finding its language ready at hand when ordinary words failed him. And this interpretation is not wrong. Oppenheimer was indeed a literary man. He did indeed love these texts. He did indeed read Sanskrit with the fluency of a scholar, spending hours with the original verses when he could have been relaxing or socializing or doing any of the things that normal people do when they are not working. But there is another way to understand this moment, another interpretation that asks different questions, Because the Bhagavad Gita is not simply a philosophical text about duty and morality and the nature of action. It is also a text that describes weapons, divine weapons of extraordinary power, weapons that the gods themselves created and feared, weapons that could destroy armies and cities and entire kingdoms in a single flash. And when we read these descriptions with modern eyes, when we pay attention to the specific physical effects the text describes, we find something unsettling, something that does not fit comfortably into our assumptions about what ancient people could have known, something that suggests the ancients were not simply imagining powerful weapons in the abstract, but describing weapons they had actually witnessed, or at the very least received detailed accounts of from sources they considered reliable. The Bhagavad Gita describes weapons like the Brahmastra and the Pashupatastra, weapons granted by the gods to favored warriors, weapons so powerful that their use was governed by strict rules and prohibitions. And the text describes these weapons in terms that are startlingly specific. It describes a light brighter than 1,000 suns. It describes heat so intense that it consumes everything it touches. It describes effects that spread far beyond the point of impact. It describes warriors who must perform specific rituals before invoking these weapons. It describes the terrible responsibility that comes with possessing such power. And when Oppenheimer watched the Trinity test, he may not have been reaching for poetry at all. He may have been reaching for the closest reference he had, the only prior description he knew of a weapon like the one he had just built. And this reframe changes everything about how we understand that moment. Because it suggests that Oppenheimer was not creating language for something unprecedented, but recognizing something he had read about, not inventing a new category of weapon, but rediscovering an old one. And the question this raises is not whether the ancients had nuclear weapons. That question is too crude, too easily dismissed. The real question is why their descriptions of divine weapons match our nuclear weapons so precisely. Why the terminology and the physical effects and the aftermath they describe align so closely with what we observed at Trinity and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and every nuclear test since. And this is not a question that can be answered with a simple yes or no. It is a question that demands careful examination of the texts themselves, careful attention to what the ancients actually wrote, rather than what we assume they must have meant. But the Bhagavad Gita is not the oldest source for these descriptions. The Sanskrit epics drew on older traditions, older stories, older knowledge that flowed into India from somewhere else. And when we trace these traditions backward in time, we find ourselves arriving at Mesopotamia, at the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, at the civilization we call Sumerian, the people who invented writing and recorded their stories in clay tablets that have survived for 5,000 years. And the Sumerians did not simply invent writing, they invented civilization itself as we understand it. They built the first cities, they created the first legal codes, they developed mathematics and astronomy and medicine. They established the first schools and the first libraries. They created a template for organized society that every subsequent civilization has followed. And in their clay tablets, we find the gods they called the Anunnaki, a word that scholars translate variously as those who from heaven came, or princely offspring, or those of royal blood. And according to these texts, the Anunnaki were not abstract deities, not spiritual forces, not metaphors for natural phenomena. They were beings who came from somewhere else, who established themselves in Mesopotamia, who built the first cities, who created humanity to serve them, and who possessed technologies far beyond anything their human servants could replicate. And among these technologies were weapons of extraordinary destructive power. Weapons that form the subject of multiple texts preserved in the archaeological record. Weapons whose descriptions have survived the collapse of empires and the burning of libraries, and the slow decay of civilizations across thousands of years. The most important of these texts is called the Era Epic, an Akkadian poem that dates to approximately 800 BCE in its current form, but draws on much older Sumerian sources that may extend back another 1,000 years or more into the murky prehistory of human civilization. And this text describes a conflict among the gods, a debate about policy that has implications for all of Mesopotamia and beyond. And at the center of this debate is Era, also known as Nergal, the god of war and plague and the underworld, a deity associated with violence and destruction, a figure who appears in numerous texts as the bringer of calamity and the lord of the dead. And Era wants to use certain weapons against cities that have displeased him, cities whose inhabitants have grown lax in their worship, or who have committed offenses that demand punishment, and other gods object to his plan. They argue against the use of these weapons, but their objection is not moral in the way we might expect. They do not argue that the cities are innocent, or that destruction is wrong, or that mercy should prevail. They argue something far more specific and far more practical. They argue that the weapons Era wants to use will have consequences that cannot be controlled, that the effects will spread beyond the intended targets, that the land itself will be poisoned and made uninhabitable, that death will travel on the wind to regions far from the point of impact, that even the gods themselves will suffer if these weapons are deployed. And when we read these objections carefully, when we pay attention to the specific concerns being raised, we find that they do not describe any conventional weapon known to the ancient world. They do not describe fire or flood or plague or any of the natural disasters that ancient peoples feared. They do not describe siege warfare or cavalry charges or any of the military technologies that the ancients actually possessed. They describe something else entirely, something with characteristics that match only one category of weapon that has ever existed. And that category is nuclear. The texts use specific terminology to describe these divine weapons and their effects. And the most important term is the Sumerian word Melam, or its Akkadian equivalent Melamu, which scholars translate as radiance or brilliance or divine splendor. And this radiance is consistently described as the defining characteristic of the most powerful weapons, a light that blinds, a light that burns, a light that cannot be looked upon directly, a light that overwhelms everything it touches. And the texts return to this concept again and again, emphasizing the radiance as the primary manifestation of divine power. And we should pause here to consider what the first witnesses to nuclear detonations reported. Because without exception, across every test and every combat use, the first thing they describe is the light, the flash that is brighter than the sun, the brilliance that burns the eyes, even through protective goggles and closed eyelids and turned backs, the light that seems to come from everywhere at once, that eliminates shadows for a fraction of a second, because it is so overwhelming that shadows cannot exist in its presence. And this is precisely what the ancient texts describe, a weapon whose primary characteristic is a radiance that surpasses anything in ordinary experience. And the match is not approximate. It is exact. It is as if the ancient scribes who composed these texts had stood where Oppenheimer stood, and seen what Oppenheimer saw, and struggled with the same inadequacy of language to describe an experience that exceeded all prior categories of understanding. The texts also describe what happens after the weapon is used. The aftermath that unfolds in the hours and days and weeks and years following the detonation. And here again, the specificity is remarkable. The land becomes barren. Nothing will grow. The soil is cursed for generations. Animals that survive the initial destruction sicken and die. People who were far from the point of impact fall ill in the following days. Their hair falls out. Their skin erupts in sores. They waste away and die from causes that are not visible, from ailments that have no names because no one has ever seen them before. And this is radiation sickness. This is what we observed at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is the slow, invisible death that distinguishes nuclear weapons from all other forms of destruction, and no conventional weapon known to antiquity produces these effects. Fire does not poison the land for generations. Flood does not cause hair to fall out. Siege does not make the soil sterile for decades. Only radiation does this. Only the particular physics of nuclear fission and the resulting contamination produces the pattern of effects that the ancient texts describe. And the ancients had no framework for understanding radiation. They had no concept of atoms or isotopes or half-lives. And yet they described the effects of radiation with clinical precision. They described symptoms that would not be scientifically documented until the 20th century. They described a pattern of destruction that we only learned to recognize after we had inflicted it on 2 Japanese cities and studied the survivors with all the tools of modern medicine. The texts further describe death carried on the wind. Cities that were not directly struck, but were nonetheless destroyed because the wind shifted and brought something lethal from the direction of the initial detonation. And this is fallout. This is the dispersion of radioactive particles by atmospheric currents. This is exactly what happened at Chernobyl, when the wind carried contamination across Europe, reaching Scandinavia and the British Isles, and every country in between. And the ancients could not have known about fallout from direct experience of nuclear weapons? Unless they had nuclear weapons, they could not have described this phenomenon with such accuracy, unless they had observed it or received detailed accounts from those who had. And yet, they did describe it in texts that have survived for thousands of years, in languages we have only recently learned to read, in clay tablets that lay buried beneath the sands of Iraq until archaeologists unearthed them and scholars slowly deciphered their contents. And what they found was not primitive mythology, not simple stories of angry gods throwing lightning bolts, but detailed technical descriptions of weapons and their effects that match our most advanced and terrible technologies. There is another tradition that bears on this question, a Hebrew tradition concerning something called the Shamir. And according to this tradition, the Shamir was a device or substance that could cut through any material, including the hardest stone, without heat and without sound. And the Shamir was said to have been used to cut the stones for Solomon's temple, since metal tools were forbidden in the construction of sacred buildings. And the tradition holds that King Solomon obtained the Shamir through supernatural means, that it was one of the wonders of his reign, that it represented a technology far beyond ordinary human capability. And the descriptions of the Shamir are remarkably specific about its handling requirements. It was kept in a container lined with lead because lead was the only material that could safely contain it. It was considered so dangerous that it could only be handled by specially trained individuals who understood its properties. It was never left uncovered or exposed even for a moment. And after the temple was completed, the Shamir was hidden or destroyed because it was too dangerous to preserve, because the sages determined that the risks of keeping such a thing outweighed any possible benefit. And we should ask what substance known to antiquity fits this description. What material cuts without heat must be shielded in lead and is so dangerous that even its keepers consider it better destroyed than preserved. Lead is the standard shielding material for radioactive substances. Nothing else in the ancient world required lead containment. No other material known to the ancients had the properties that the Shamir is described as having. And while this does not prove that the Shamir was radioactive, it establishes that the ancients were describing something with properties that match radioactive materials and nothing else they knew. And the tradition of lead containment is too specific to be coincidental, too precise to be the product of random imagination. We must return now to the era epic and examine the divine debate in greater detail, because this debate has implications that extend far beyond ancient mythology. The gods who oppose error make arguments that are remarkably sophisticated, arguments that would not be out of place in a modern discussion of nuclear weapons policy. They argue that these weapons cannot be controlled once they are deployed, that the chain of effects once initiated cannot be stopped by any power, human or divine. They argue that the destruction will spread beyond the intended targets through mechanisms that the users cannot prevent, that winds will carry death to regions that were never meant to be struck. They argue that the land will be rendered useless to everyone, including the gods themselves. That victory achieved through such weapons is no victory at all, because the victors will inherit only poison and desolation. They argue that using these weapons establishes a precedent that endangers everyone, that once the taboo is broken, it can never be restored, that other gods and other powers will feel justified in using similar weapons for their own purposes. And this is the logic of nuclear deterrence. This is the argument against first use. This is the framework of mutually assured destruction that governed Cold War strategy and continues to shape nuclear policy today. And the question we must ask is how the Sumerians knew this, how they developed a framework for thinking about weapons of mass destruction that exactly parallels our own framework. Did they reason their way to these conclusions through abstract thought, through the pure exercise of imagination and logic, or did they learn these principles the way we learned them, through the bitter experience of actually using these weapons and observing their effects, through watching cities burn and populations sicken and lands become uninhabitable, through living with the consequences of decisions that could not be undone? The texts further describe that after certain weapons were used, the gods themselves abandoned the affected regions. They would not return. They established what we would call exclusion zones, areas that remained off-limits for extended periods because the contamination had not yet subsided, because the land was still dangerous even to divine beings. And we know these zones by other names. We know Chernobyl, we know the areas around Fukushima, and we know the test sites in Nevada and Kazakhstan and the Pacific, where the ground remains poisoned decades after the last detonation, where visitors must wear protective equipment and limit their exposure time and undergo decontamination procedures afterward. and the ancients described the same phenomenon. Gods who cannot or will not return to lands they themselves have devastated, not because the lands were destroyed in some absolute sense, but because they were rendered uninhabitable by lingering effects that persisted long after the initial destruction had ended. And the concept of an exclusion zone is not intuitive. It is not something that would occur naturally to people whose experience of warfare was limited to swords and spears and siege engines, because conventional warfare does not create exclusion zones. Conventional warfare may destroy buildings and kill populations, but it does not poison the land itself. It does not make the very soil dangerous to touch. And yet the ancients describe exactly this phenomenon. They describe regions that remained forbidden for generations. They describe a type of destruction that outlasts the moment of violence and continues its work long after the attackers have departed. The Sumerians did not simply describe a big explosion. They did not simply imagine the biggest fire they could conceive of and call it divine. They described a weapon class with governance. They described rules and prohibitions and debates and policies. They described an entire framework for managing weapons so powerful that their use threatened everyone, including their wielders. And they described exactly the framework we built 4,000 years later when we faced the same problem they faced, the problem of possessing weapons so powerful that their use threatens the users as much as the targets. The problem of deterrence and first use and mutual assured destruction. The problem of how to prevent the use of weapons that cannot be uninvented. And this is the question the script will pursue through everything that follows. Not the crude question of whether the ancients had nuclear weapons, but the more subtle and more troubling question of why their descriptions match ours so precisely. Why their policy debates mirror our policy debates. Why their terminology describes effects that we have only recently learned to identify and measure. And whether we invented these weapons for the first time in 1945, or whether we rediscovered something that had been known and lost and known again across cycles of history, we have forgotten how to remember. The scribes who wrote these texts were not scientists in any modern sense. They were priests and scholars trained in traditions that stretched back centuries before their time. They were recording knowledge that they had inherited from their predecessors, knowledge that was already ancient when they pressed reed into wet clay and created the tablets we now struggle to read, and they were explicit about the sources of their knowledge. They attributed it to the gods themselves, to the Anunnaki who had come from heaven and established the first cities and taught humanity the arts of civilization. And we may dismiss this attribution as mythology, as primitive people personifying forces they did not understand. But we should at least consider the possibility that they meant what they said, that they were recording as accurately as they could the information they had received from sources they considered authoritative. And if those sources had actually witnessed nuclear weapons, actually observed the effects we now recognize from our own terrible experiments, then the precision of the ancient descriptions begins to make sense. The clinical accuracy of the symptoms they describe begins to seem less like imagination and more like documentation. The policy debates they record begin to seem less like abstract philosophy and more like the desperate arguments of beings who had learned through bitter experience exactly what these weapons could do. If these texts are merely myth, then they should have faded into obscurity the way countless other ancient stories have faded, and Mesopotamia should be one historical region among many no more significant than any other fertile valley where early humans settled and built their first permanent structures. But something strange has happened. Instead, something that looks less like the normal flow of history and more like compulsion, like a gravity that pulls every sufficiently powerful civilization toward the same coordinates on Earth. And to understand this pattern, we need to trace it from the beginning, because the sequence is not random and the consistency is not coincidental. The Sumerians built the first cities here sometime around 4500 BCE, and they flourished for more than 1,000 years, creating writing and mathematics and astronomy and law, and then around 2334 BCE. Sargon of Akkad rose from the north and conquered them, absorbing their culture even as he dominated their cities. And the Akkadian Empire held this land until it collapsed around 2154 BCE, giving way to a brief Sumerian renaissance before the Babylonians under Hammurabi united the region around 1792 BCE, and Babylon became the center of the world for a time, until the Kassites swept down from the Zagros Mountains around 1595 BCE and ruled for 4 centuries before the Assyrians, who had been building power in the north, finally achieved dominance around 911 BCE, creating one of the most brutal and effective military empires the ancient world had ever seen, and they held Mesopotamia until 609 BCE, when the Neo-Babylonians under Nabopolassar and his son Nebuchadnezzar reclaimed the land and rebuilt Babylon to even greater glory. And then, in 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon in a single night, according to the ancient accounts, and Mesopotamia became a Persian province for 2 centuries, until Alexander of Macedon arrived in 331 BCE, fresh from conquering Egypt, and determined to take the heart of the Persian Empire for himself. And Alexander did take it, and he died in Babylon in 323 BCE in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. And after his death, his generals divided his empire, and the Seleucids held Mesopotamia until the Parthians pushed in from the east around 141 BCE, and then Rome, which had conquered the entire Mediterranean world, began pushing east, because Rome always pushed east. Eventually, and the Romans and Parthians fought over this land for centuries, until the Sassanid Persians replaced the Parthians and continued the contest with Rome. And then, in 636 CE, the Arab armies carrying the new faith of Islam swept out of the Arabian Peninsula and took Mesopotamia from the Sassanids. And Baghdad became the center of the Islamic Golden Age, the greatest city in the world for a time, until the Mongols arrived in 1258 CE and destroyed it so thoroughly that some historians believe the region never fully recovered. And the Mongols were followed by the Timurids, and then the Safavid Persians, and then the Ottoman Turks, who held the land for 4 centuries, until the British arrived during World War I and drew new borders and created new nations and installed new rulers. And then, finally, in 2003, the Americans came with crews, missiles and armored divisions, and took Baghdad in 3 weeks. This is the sequence. And when you see it laid out like this, something becomes apparent that is not obvious when you encounter these conquests one at a time in history books. Because this is not simply a frequently conquered region, and there are many frequently conquered regions throughout history, and the plains of northern Europe have been fought over repeatedly, And the Korean peninsula has been invaded again and again, and the Levantine coast has changed hands dozens of times. But none of these places exhibits the pattern that Mesopotamia exhibits. Because what makes Mesopotamia different is not that it has been conquered, but that it has been sought. And there is a distinction here that matters. Because being conquered can happen passively as a byproduct of larger conflicts, or geographic accident, or simple proximity to aggressive neighbors. But being sought is different, because being sought means that empires actively turn toward this place as a destination, not as a waypoint. And when you examine the history closely, you see that this is exactly what happened over and over again. Alexander did not need Mesopotamia, because by the time he crossed the Euphrates, he already controlled Greece and Egypt and most of Anatolia, and he had more territory than he could effectively govern, and more wealth than he could spend in 100 lifetimes, and the strategic logic of his campaign said he should consolidate what he had, but instead he pressed on specifically toward Babylon, specifically toward the ancient cities, specifically toward this land, as if something was pulling him forward, and he made Babylon his capital. Not Pella, not Alexandria, not any of the Greek cities he loved, but Babylon, the ancient city that the Sumerians said the gods had built. And he died there in the palace where Nebuchadnezzar had walked, and where the priests of Marduk still performed rituals that were already 2,000 years old. Rome did not need Mesopotamia, because Rome already had the entire Mediterranean, and Gaul and Britain and North Africa, and more grain and gold and slaves than any empire in history. And the Romans understood better than anyone that expansion has costs, and that distant provinces drain resources, and that the Parthian frontier was a money pit that consumed legions without strategic return. And yet emperor after emperor sent armies east toward these same coordinates, and Trajan actually conquered Mesopotamia briefly in 116 CE. Even though he was already old, and his empire was already vast, and there was no rational reason for him to be there, and he stood on the shore of the Persian Gulf, and reportedly wept because there was nowhere left to conquer. But the point is that he had gone there specifically as if compelled, as if Rome could not be complete, until it held the land between the rivers. The Mongols did not need Mesopotamia, because by 1258, when Hulagu Khan's armies arrived at the gates of Baghdad, the Mongols already ruled the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from Korea to Poland, and they had more horses and warriors and territory than they could ever use. And Baghdad was far from the Mongol heartland and offered no strategic value that could justify the cost of conquest. And yet, Hulagu came anyway, and he did not simply defeat Baghdad, he obliterated it. And some estimates suggest that between 1 and 2 million people died in the sack of the city, and the Tigris ran black with ink from the books that were thrown into it, and red with the blood of scholars. And the destruction was so complete and so deliberate that it suggests something beyond ordinary conquest, because ordinary conquest wants to acquire resources. But the Mongol destruction of Baghdad looked more like something was being erased, or something was being searched for in the rubble. And this pattern repeats and repeats and repeats across 4,000 years of recorded history, and every empire that rises to sufficient power eventually turns toward this same strip of land between the Tigris and Euphrates. as if reaching a certain threshold of dominance triggers an awareness that this place matters. And the awareness seems to precede any rational strategic calculation, because the empires come before they have reasons to come, and they seek before they know what they are seeking. And this looks less like the normal behavior of expanding powers and more like something else entirely. And the question we must ask is what draws them. The conventional explanations are familiar, and they are not wrong exactly, but they are insufficient. Because yes, Mesopotamia sits at the intersection of 3 continents, and yes, the Fertile Crescent was agriculturally productive. And yes, in the modern era, there is oil beneath this ground. And yes, the rivers provide water and transportation. And yes, the land lies along ancient trade routes connecting east and west. But none of these explanations account for the intensity of the pattern, because there are other places with similar geographic advantages that have not been sought with this consistency. And there are other regions with oil that do not draw empire after empire across millennia. And there are other fertile valleys and other trade crossroads and other strategic positions, and none of them have been the object of this kind of focused, relentless, transgenerational pursuit. And so, the conventional explanations tell us why Mesopotamia is valuable, but they do not tell us why it is singular. And they do not tell us why the seeking has the quality of compulsion rather than calculation. Now consider a second pattern that runs parallel to the pattern of conquest, because every empire that takes Mesopotamia starts digging, and this is true across thousands of years and across completely different cultures and civilizations, and it suggests that the conquest itself is not the end but the beginning of something else. The Babylonians who conquered the Sumerians did not simply rule over Sumerian cities. They excavated Sumerian sites, and they collected Sumerian texts, and they studied the Sumerian language, even though Sumerian was already dead as a spoken tongue. And they treated Sumerian the way later Europeans would treat Latin and Greek, as a sacred scholarly language that preserved ancient knowledge. And Babylonian scribes spent centuries copying Sumerian tablets, and Babylonian kings funded expeditions to find older tablets, and Babylonian priests maintained Sumerian rituals that they no longer fully understood, because the rituals were ancient, and the ancients had known something, and the Babylonians were trying to recover whatever that something was. The Assyrians carried this tradition even further, and Ashurbanipal, who ruled from 668 to 627 BCE, was not only one of the most powerful kings in the ancient world, but also one of the most scholarly, and he was literate in Sumerian and Akkadian at a time when most kings could barely write their own names. And he built the greatest library the ancient world had ever seen at Nineveh, and he filled it with tens of thousands of tablets, and he sent scribes throughout his empire with explicit instructions to find and copy every ancient text they could locate. And his letters to these scribes survive, and in them he demands that they search temple archives and private collections and buried repositories for tablets that might contain ancient knowledge. And he is specific about what he wants, because he wants the old texts, the texts from before the texts, that describe what the first people knew, and the scope of his search and the urgency of his letters suggest that he was not simply collecting for the sake of collecting, but looking for something specific. And when Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, the library was buried and would not be rediscovered until 1849 CE, when Austin Henry Layard, a British archaeologist, began excavating and found more than 30,000 tablets, which now form the core of the British Museum's Mesopotamian collection. And this brings us to the British. Because when Britain extended its influence into Mesopotamia in the 19th and 20th centuries, the British immediately began digging with an intensity and focus that exceeded any previous archaeological effort anywhere in the world. And the British Museum launched expedition after expedition and excavated site after site and shipped hundreds of thousands of artifacts back to London. And the scale of this removal was so vast that the British Museum today holds more Mesopotamian artifacts than all Iraqi museums combined. And the question that is rarely asked is why this particular intensity and why this particular focus? Because the British had an empire that spanned the globe and they could have excavated anywhere. And they did excavate in Egypt and Greece and Rome and India, but nowhere else received the concentrated, sustained attention that Mesopotamia received. And the archaeologists themselves often wrote about feeling that they were looking for something specific, even when they could not articulate what that something was. And Layard and Rawlinson and Woolley and all the others who dug in the sands of Iraq described a sense of urgency in their work, as if the answers to important questions lay just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. And then there is 2003 and the invasion of Iraq, and what happened in the immediate aftermath of the American conquest. And the pattern holds because the Americans, like every empire before them, came to Mesopotamia. And like every empire before them, the taking of artifacts was among the first things that happened, even though the taking wore different clothes this time. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad was one of the greatest repositories of ancient Mesopotamian artifacts in the world, and it held pieces that dated back to the very beginning of human civilization. And when American forces entered Baghdad in April 2003, they secured certain sites immediately, and the oil ministry was protected by tanks and soldiers within hours. But the Iraq Museum was left unguarded, and in the chaos, looters entered, and over the following days, thousands of artifacts disappeared, and some estimates suggest that 15,000 pieces were taken, though the exact number has never been determined. And among the missing items were cylinder seals and cuneiform tablets and artifacts from Ur and Uruk and Eridu and other sites that the Sumerians considered sacred. And many of these items have never been recovered, and some have surfaced on the black market, and some have appeared in private collections, and some have simply vanished. The official explanation is that this was a failure of planning, and that in the fog of war, mistakes were made, and that the military simply did not have enough troops to secure every important site. And this explanation may be true, but it is worth noting that troops were available to secure the oil ministry, and troops were available to secure government buildings. And the question of priorities is a question of what mattered. And the fact that ancient artifacts were not protected while oil infrastructure was protected tells us something about stated priorities. But then there is the secondary question of where those artifacts went, and who has them now, and what they contained. Because many of the stolen tablets had never been translated, and some contained texts that scholars had never seen. And the information on those tablets is now in unknown hands. And this pattern of digging and taking extends beyond the museum to the archaeological sites themselves, because during and after the invasion, certain ancient sites received military protection and certain sites did not. and the pattern of protection does not correlate with publicly stated archaeological importance. And some sites of tremendous historical significance were left exposed to looting, while other sites received immediate security. And the criteria for these decisions have never been fully explained. And when scholars and journalists have asked about the criteria, they have received vague answers about operational security and resource limitations. But the pattern exists, and the pattern suggests that someone was making decisions about which sites mattered, and the decisions were not based on the standard archaeological metrics. The Ottomans before the British also dug in Mesopotamia, and they also removed artifacts, though on a smaller scale. And the Persians before them showed interest in the ancient sites. And the Arabs during the Islamic Golden Age translated ancient texts and studied ancient knowledge, and every single power that has held this land has exhibited the same behavior, which is that they arrive and they conquer, and then they start looking beneath the surface as if the conquest was never the point, and the digging was always the objective. So we must ask the question directly, even though the question sounds strange, because strangeness is not a reason to avoid asking, and the question is this: why does every empire that achieves sufficient power eventually march toward Mesopotamia? And why is the first action of every occupier to start excavating? And why has this specific strip of land been the object of more concentrated conquest and more intensive archaeological attention than any other place on Earth? The conventional answers are real, but they are partial, and they explain value but not singularity, and they explain interest but not obsession, and they do not explain why the pattern holds across cultures that had no contact with each other, and across eras separated by millennia, and the consistency suggests that something beyond ordinary historical forces is operating here. Consider that the Sumerians themselves offered an explanation, and it is preserved in their texts. And they said that the gods chose this land before humans existed. And they said that the gods established their first presence here, and built their first structures here, and placed something here that would matter forever. And the Sumerian king list, which is one of the oldest historical documents in existence, begins with the phrase "after the kingship descended from heaven." The kingship was in Eridu, and this is not a metaphor in the Sumerian understanding, because the Sumerians were clear that the gods were physical beings who came from somewhere else and chose this specific location. And what the gods placed here remained here even after the gods withdrew. Every empire that has come to Mesopotamia has had access to these texts or to traditions derived from these texts, because the Babylonians preserved Sumerian knowledge, and the Assyrians preserved Babylonian knowledge, and the Persians encountered this knowledge when they conquered, and the Greeks under Alexander encountered it, and the Arabs translated it, and the Europeans rediscovered it. And at every stage the texts said the same thing, which is that this land was chosen, and something was placed here, and the digging across 4,000 years looks less like coincidence and more like a sustained multi-generational search for whatever the first civilization said was buried here. The Sumerians did not start the wars over this land, but they may have started the reason for the wars, because they told the world what was here, and every empire since has been trying to find it. And the pattern we observe is not random conquest, but directed seeking. And the question is not why do empires want territory, because we understand that, but why do empires want this territory specifically? And the answer may lie in what the Sumerians recorded and what still lies beneath the sand, unexcavated and unknown and waiting. Now we narrow our focus to a single point on the map, a place whose name echoes through the oldest records our species possesses. A site that sits today in southern Iraq, near the ancient coastline where the Persian Gulf once reached much further inland than it does now, a place called Eridu. And, according to the Sumerian texts, this was not merely an important city or an early settlement, but the first city, not the first Sumerian city, but the first city on Earth, the place where everything we call civilization began. And the texts are remarkably explicit about this claim. They do not suggest or imply. They state directly that this is where the gods came first. This is where they established their initial presence on this planet. This is where the entire project of what we now call human history was set into motion. And when we examine the Sumerian king list, one of the oldest historical documents in existence, a clay tablet that traces the lineage of rulership back to the very beginning of recorded time, we find that it opens with Eridu. The text states after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. And we should pause on that phrase, descended from heaven, because the Sumerians are not being poetic here. They are making a specific claim about origin. They are saying that authority, knowledge, and civilization itself came from somewhere else, and that the first place it touched down was Eridu. The texts do not say humans built Eridu. They do not describe primitive people gradually learning to stack mud bricks and form a settlement. They say the gods chose this location and established themselves there. And when archaeological excavations began at the site, first by British teams in the 19th century, and then by Iraqi archaeologists in the 20th century, they found something that challenged comfortable assumptions about how civilization develops. Beneath the sand, they uncovered a continuous sequence of temple buildings, one constructed directly on top of another, layer after layer going down into the earth. And this sequence extends back to at least 5000 BCE, making it one of the oldest continuously occupied sacred sites ever discovered. But what struck the excavators as strange, what continues to puzzle anyone who studies the findings carefully, is that the oldest structures show sophisticated architecture. The earliest temples at Eridu are not crude huts, gradually refined over generations. They are well designed and carefully constructed from the very beginning. There is no primitive phase. There is no visible learning curve. The archaeological record at Eridu does not show development in the way every other ancient site shows development. It shows arrival, as if someone or something came to this location already knowing how to build, already possessing the knowledge that other sites took centuries to develop. And this is anomalous in a way that mainstream archaeology has never fully explained. Every other site we have studied shows a progression from simple to complex, from rough to refined, from amateur to expert. But Eridu simply appears in the record fully formed. The oldest layers are as sophisticated as the later ones. And when we examine the excavation history of this site more closely, we find another pattern emerging, one that echoes everything we have already observed about Mesopotamia. British archaeologists began digging at Eridu in the 19th century during the height of imperial interest in the region. They made significant discoveries and documented the upper layers of the temple sequence. Then the work paused. The further expeditions followed over the years, and during the 20th century, Iraqi archaeologists took over and continued pushing deeper into the site. Fuad Safar and his team, in the 1940s made extraordinary progress, revealing temple after temple going down through the millennia. But then the work stopped. Political instability intervened, wars erupted, governments changed, and excavation halted. And this has happened again and again. Every time serious work at Eridu gains momentum, every time archaeologists begin approaching the oldest and deepest layers, something happens to stop them. The site has never been fully excavated. The deepest levels remain unexplored. We have never reached the bottom. We have never seen what lies beneath the oldest temples. The excavators were able to document, and we might dismiss this as coincidence, as simple bad luck, or the unfortunate reality of doing archaeology in a politically unstable region, except that the pattern is so consistent, so perfectly timed to interrupt precisely when the work becomes most interesting, that it becomes difficult not to notice. The existing excavations have revealed extraordinary things. The sequence of temples, each built on the foundations of the one before, represents one of the longest continuous religious traditions in human history. For thousands of years, people returned to this exact spot to worship, to build, to maintain a connection to something they considered sacred beyond measure. The Sumerians worshipped at Eridu, and the Akkadians after them, and the Babylonians after them. The tradition stretched across millennia and across the rise and fall of multiple civilizations. And all of them left records explaining why this place mattered. The oldest texts say that the god Enki established his house at Eridu, and Enki in Sumerian tradition was not merely one god among many. He was the god who created humanity, the god who gave humans the gifts of knowledge and civilization, the god who in later traditions would be remembered as the one who warned a single man about the coming flood and gave him instructions to build a vessel to survive it. Enki is the closest thing the Sumerian pantheon has to a protagonist, the deity most consistently portrayed as caring about human welfare and human advancement. And according to the texts, he chose Eridu as his dwelling place. He built his temple there. He established his presence at this exact location on Earth. And beneath the temples, the texts say he placed something. They are not entirely clear about what. The language becomes obscure and possibly coded when discussing certain subjects. But the implication is that something was deposited at Eridu for safekeeping, something important enough that it needed to be placed at the most sacred site, beneath the house of the god who created humanity, and the excavations have never reached it. Whatever is down there remains buried, and we cannot simply demand access. We cannot excavate at will. The site sits in a region that has been through war after war, disruption after disruption. And so the deepest layers of the first city remain beyond our reach. Now we must state the Sumerian claim directly, because everything we have explored leads to this moment. According to these texts, the gods chose Mesopotamia. They chose it before humans existed. They chose it before there were people to build cities or write records or wonder about origins. They established themselves here. They built their first structures here. They conducted their first experiments here. And when humans were created, they were created here, in this land, near this place, and the weapons described in the Era epic, the weapons the gods debated and eventually banned, the weapons that poisoned the land and carried death on the wind. According to these same traditions, some of those weapons, or the knowledge to build them, were placed in the keeping of specific sites. Eridu was the first and most sacred of those sites, the house of Enki, the dwelling of the god who gave humanity knowledge, and we cannot verify this claim. We have no way to prove it true or false. We can only note that the texts make it, that the Sumerians wrote it down in clay and baked it hard, and left it for anyone who came after to find. We can only note that every empire that has achieved sufficient power has eventually turned toward this land. We can only note that every occupier digs. We can only note the pattern that stretches across 5,000 years of recorded history, the compulsion that seems to grip civilizations once they reach a certain threshold of dominance, the need to come here and start looking for something beneath the surface. And the Sumerians did not start the wars over this land. They did not begin the cycle of conquest that has continued to this day. But they may have started the reason for the wars. They recorded what was here before them. They wrote down the claims and the names and the locations. They told the world that this place was chosen, that something was placed here at the beginning, and every empire since has been trying to reach what the first civilization said was buried here. First, the British came and dug, the Iraqis continued and dug deeper. Wars interrupted and the digging paused. New powers arrived and the digging resumed in different forms. And still the deepest layers remain untouched. Still the oldest secrets remain in the ground. Still the house of Enki keeps whatever was placed beneath it thousands of years ago. And we are left with a question that has no comfortable answer, a pattern that has no innocent explanation. A claim written in the oldest language we can read, stating that this land was chosen before we existed, and that something was left here for those who might one day return to find it. We return now to where we began, to the New Mexico desert on July 16th, 1945, to the moment before the flash and the silence that preceded the loudest sound in human history. To a man standing in a bunker with equations in his mind and ancient texts in his memory. And we ask one final time what happened in the space between the detonation and the words that followed. Because Robert Oppenheimer was not a religious man. He did not believe in gods or miracles or divine intervention. He was a scientist trained in the rigorous language of physics, where every claim must be tested and verified and reproduced. Yet he spent his entire adult life studying texts that most scientists would dismiss as irrelevant. Sanskrit epics and Greek tragedies and Latin histories. He learned languages that had no practical application to his research, simply because he wanted to read the original words, to understand what the ancients had actually said before. Translation smoothed away the difficult details, and in those texts, he found descriptions of weapons that did not fit their era. Weapons of overwhelming light that blinded before they destroyed. Weapons that poisoned the land so nothing would grow for generations. Weapons that caused the hair of survivors to fall out and their blood to weaken until they died from wounds that should have healed. Weapons so terrible that the beings who wielded them established rules and treaties and prohibitions against their use. And Oppenheimer read these descriptions, and perhaps he wondered, perhaps he filed them away in some corner of his extraordinary mind, and then he built the bomb. And then he watched it detonate. And in that moment of witnessing, he did not speak like a scientist, did not quantify or measure or analyze, but instead spoke words that had been waiting for 4,000 years to be relevant again. And maybe that is all it was. Maybe it was just poetry, just a literary man reaching for grand language in a grand moment. Or maybe it was recognition. Maybe in the flash of Trinity, he saw something he had read about, something described so precisely in ancient texts that no other words fit. Maybe he understood in that instant that he had not invented anything at all, that he had simply remembered that humanity had walked this path before, and the record of that walking was preserved in clay tablets and palm leaf manuscripts, and oral traditions passed down through millennia by people who were trying to warn us. And if this is true, then the story we tell ourselves about progress and discovery and the forward march of science needs revision. Because the Sumerians were not primitive. They were survivors. They inherited knowledge from something that came before them, and they wrote it down so we would not forget. They told us about the Anunnaki and their weapons, and their debates about whether such weapons should ever be used. They told us about the destruction of cities and the poisoning of land, and the winds that carried death across hundreds of miles. They told us that some things should remain buried, and we did not listen. We came to their land, and we dug. Every empire that rose to sufficient power eventually turned toward Mesopotamia, as if pulled by something older than strategy, or resources, or trade routes. Babylonians and Assyrians, and Persians, and Greeks, and Romans, and Arabs, and Mongols, and Ottomans, and British and Americans, all of them marching toward the same coordinates, all of them starting to excavate the moment they arrived, looking for something the Sumerians said was placed here at the beginning. And tonight, the Mesopotamian plain lies quiet under the same stars that watched the Anunnaki descend, the same stars that watched the first cities rise, the same stars that watched empires come and go and come again, and beneath the sand the oldest temples remain only partially explored. Layer under layer of sacred architecture going down to depths that have never been reached. Because every time the digging gets serious, something interrupts it. War or politics or funding or fate. And below those temples, something waits. Something that was placed there before humans had any say in the matter. Something that the Sumerians said would be found when the time was right, or when the wrong people finally dug deep enough. And we do not know what it is. We only know that the texts describe it, that every empire has sought it, that Eridu has never been fully excavated despite being the site the ancients called the first place, the location where kingship descended from heaven. And so we are left not with answers, but with the echo of a question that has been repeating since the first scribe pressed reed into clay. The question of what was here before us and what they left behind, and why every center of human power eventually feels the pull toward this specific piece of earth. And perhaps Oppenheimer heard that echo when the flash lit up the desert. Perhaps, in that moment, he understood that the weapon he built was not new, but ancient, not invented, but recovered, not progress, but repetition. And perhaps that is why he reached for words written before Rome, before Greece, before even Babylon, words from a text that remembered what we had agreed to forget. And the desert holds that memory now, the glass where sand once was, the silence where the countdown once echoed. And somewhere beneath the plains of Iraq, the oldest secrets wait in darkness for the next empire to arrive, with shovels and questions and the eternal human conviction that this time we will finally understand what the gods left buried when they departed this world for the last time.